Welcome to my October 16th creating photos and videos. Except for my iPhone 7 Plus, I use my Panasonic GM-5 camera exclusively on our recent trip to Canada. And I'm really glad that I did this. And part of the reason I did it was to determine whether I really did want to take just this camera to Europe, or to take this one instead of my EM5 Mark II, for example. And so the experiment worked out great. I'm happy with all the pictures I got. But there were two areas that that kind of concerned me. And one was the need to use this dial in the back. There's a little dial right here, and that lets you choose in shutter priority, which is what I typically will shoot in when I'm sightseeing, walking around. I want to control the shutter. I don't want to get blurry pictures. And so if in that situation, this little dial in the back is how I change the shutter speed, make it slower, make it faster. And the only other control I have in shutter priority is exposure compensation. And to get to that, I have to press this dial in, and then exposure compensation is the option that shows up. So then when I move the dial, I'm changing the exposure compensation. And this worked out fine. So the other area that I had some concerns with was focus, or locking on focus, because in several situations, several scenes, I'd find myself going to take the shot and it wouldn't shoot. And the camera won't typically shoot if it cannot set focus. And it can't set focus typically because there's not enough contrast and it can't determine the correct focus in autofocus mode. The solution to that typically is to go to manual shooting mode. And the nice thing about this 12-40 lens, this Olympus 12-40, is I can just pull this little barrel back and I'm now in manual focus. So that made that really very easy. The purpose of today's video is to talk about the Q menu that I've discovered. It was there all along, I just didn't really remember it, on the GM5. And this relates to the fact that since I bought this camera a year and a half ago, I really have not explored all the features of it. I just use it typically, just changing, usually in manual mode, shutter priority mode, or whatever. Recently, when I was doing some studying, if you will, on learning a little bit more about the camera, I saw the guy talking about the Q menu. And the Q menu kind of solves the problem of the little dial on the back. But before we get into that, just what is possible to do with using the Q menu, which is simply by clicking on the trash can icon, which when you are in shooting mode, not review mode, and you're not looking at your images. If you're looking at your images and you press the trash can, then you're going to delete images. But when you're in the shooting mode, as I am right now, and I press the Q, the trash can icon, it's now the Q menu. The purpose of the Q menu is to give you access without having to dive into all the menus to the kinds of things that you typically want to change. If this whole idea of balancing shutter speed and aperture, shooting in manual mode or shooting in shutter priority mode, if that's all Greek to you, then please take a look at my Learning Photography series. So you want to be able to control things such as shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and a variety of other things, your focus mode, your metering mode, and all these different things. But to jump into the menus when you're out shooting in the middle of, Munich or in Toronto or whatever it is, it's just not, you can't just stand there and you can't pull the menu out and start looking. But the Q menu gives you, the point is, the Q menu gives you access to a variety of typical settings that you want to be able to change and control. So let's take a look at that Q menu. All right, before we go in the Q menu, let me show you the screen, one of the screen displays. There are multiple screen displays, but this is a screen display that shows you a lot of information. Histogram, which mode you're in, shutter priority, standard picture. So it's telling you a lot of the things, how things are set that are possibly set through the Q menu. Now, to get to the Q menu, I'm going to press this little button, which you can't see very well there, but I'll make that a little more visible. Actually, wait a minute, I want to go here. I want to change the display so it doesn't have all that information on it, because we're going to, in a second, I'm going to put a lot of other information. I'm going to press the Q menu, And it goes to whatever the last thing was that I looked at, and it's the one area focusing. So it's on AFS or autofocus. All right, I've changed the lighting a little bit so that the screen's a little bit darker, and hopefully you can see more of the items that are in the Q menu. And if you notice across the top, we're on AFS, as I said. And down at the bottom, you can see some other items that I can change. And I get there by hitting the right arrow or the 3 o'clock position on this dial in the back. And I click on that now, it's multi-metering. Now watch, it's going to jump over the 2.8, which is the aperture that the lens is set to currently, because I'm in shutter priority mode. So it goes right over to shutter. And here I can change the shutter. Now, if I click the 12 o'clock position button, and now I can use the dial to change the shutter from 1/25th of a second to 1/50th of a second or whatever. So I'll put it back to 1/125th. If I press the down or the 6 o'clock position, it takes me out of changing mode and back into selection mode. And now I can go over to exposure compensation. And then to the right of that, you see ISO, and to the right of that, auto white balance or white balance control. But the point that I want to make about the quick menu and how it's useful as an adjunct to the little dial on the back of the camera is that this also has a touch screen, so I can hit the exit and it takes me out of there. And let me change the display. Is back to a normal display. And so I can change the shutter speed with the dial. This is, right, without going into any menus at all. But if I want to change the exposure compensation, as I said, I have to press that dial in and then I can change it. Now, if all I'm doing is changing exposure compensation, then I can leave it that way, and that's probably fine. But if I want to go back and forth, then I can use the dial on the back to change shutter speed, and I can use the quick menu by clicking the quick menu button, and I've left it on exposure compensation. I press the 12 o'clock button, and now I can overexpose by 3 stops or underexpose, or by 1 stop in that case. By going to the left, I'm underexposed. So you can see the screen is getting darker. One other thing to point out here is notice that I have a range of -5 to a +5. That means I can underexpose up to 5 stops and I can overexpose by 5 stops. Conclusion here is this is a handy discovery that the Q menu can let me access that so quickly. It is something I plan to use on our next trip. So thank you very much for checking in on this, creating photos and videos. And I'll see you in the next one, and we'll take a look at other functions of the Q menu, other controls that I have over the Q menu in a future episode. Goodbye.